Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and along with me today is Diane Lalonde. And the rest of our team are in other offices all helping out with this production. And on behalf of the whole team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. And the webinar is on Story Shifters, co-creating new stories about trauma. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. As settlers, we commit to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular, to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across the country. Today, the webinar comes from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub. And before I introduce our webinar speaker, Dr. Barbara Ward, I will go through the format for today. Barbara will present for 1 hour, and during her presentation, we invite you to enter any questions that you may have or comments in the question and answer box. And Diane will monitor those, and then together we'll pose those questions to Dr. Ward at the end of the presentation. And that will take place during the last 15 minutes of the webinar today, so from 2 to 2:15. The presentation slides, they're posted on our website, and as well, Sarah sent out a link to everyone that has registered so that they could access and print the slides prior to the webinar. And it'll also be in the chat box. So if somebody missed that mail out and wants to print the slides, they may do so. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation. And we look for your comments. It helps us plan for the future, to know what to do more of, what to do less of. And when you complete the evaluation, then a screen will come up and it'll ask you to enter your full name and email address. And we always like to stress that that allows us to ensure that you get your certificate of participation for this webinar today. But there is no link between the name that you enter and your responses on the evaluation. The evaluation is completely anonymous. And to those of you who like to share your name anyway, we appreciate that, and that is fine, but it's completely optional. We want you to know that the recording of this webinar will be posted on our website within the next few days. And once posted, Sarah Mohammed will send out a link for everybody who registered so that they can access it or share that link with people who may want to access it on our website. So with that, I will introduce our speaker. Dr. Barbara Ward is a registered social worker and a leading expert in children's mental health with 25 years experience in the field. Her training and knowledge of child and youth trauma encompasses family violence, abuse and neglect, complex trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and children's mental health. Barbara is currently the mental health lead with the Waterloo Region District School Board here in Ontario. And her role involves influencing the education system as it attends to student mental wellness. Barbara previously served as the Director of Services as well as a manager and a clinician in the Child and Family Therapy Program in a large children's mental health organization in the Waterloo region. We have been so looking forward to today's webinar, and we're delighted that you are with us, Barbara, and for all the work you did in preparing this webinar. And we're happy to turn it over to you and welcome you to our webinar.
Thank you, Linda, for that kind introduction and that warm welcome. Unfortunately, I'm having technical difficulties with my screen, and you can see my slides, but you're not going to be able to see me. I might pop up at the end, though. So I'm really excited as well for this opportunity to connect with you today on an alternative way to look at trauma. I first want to acknowledge, though, that this research was completed from a white, middle-aged, middle-class, English-speaking woman's perspective immersed in the Canadian culture. I acknowledge that there are many voices and concepts not represented in this research because they were beyond the scope of this project, which was completed for my dissertation for my PhD in psychology from University of Brussels about 3 years ago. So today we will briefly review why our current view of childhood trauma needs to be shifted from one of woundedness to one that is resilience-based. And I'll go over some background information and review of some concepts in social constructionism. We'll review 8 resilience-based story shifters that can make a difference for someone who has experienced trauma. We'll talk about how clinicians can use some story shifters in counseling sessions, and I want to show you a tool that I created to assist with this. And as well, we'll talk about the power that community members, helpers, and mentors have in shifting trauma stories, both on an individual basis, but also on a collective basis. So first, let's talk about for a minute, what is trauma? So what words come to mind when you hear the word trauma? Just take a moment to think about this. We usually hear words like victim, depression, anxiety, shame and blame, hurt, trust issues, nightmares, powerless, loneliness, isolation, and so on. And these words come from a deficit discourse, and they are from a dominant discourse of trauma. And by discourse, we mean the talk or the conversations that we use to convey our thoughts and our perspectives. The dominant discourse of trauma are typically very pathologizing, isolating, and full of shame. So as much as I acknowledge the toxic stress and the impact of trauma on brain connections, brain architecture, and child development, I think that our relationships, our relational experiences, and the language that we use can better shift the meaning that we give to an event such as trauma. And I believe that we need to shift this deficit and this dominant discourse of thinking, and we need to consider all aspects of trauma, including the definition around post-traumatic growth and resilience. When we think about these words that we had mentioned, and if we think about other words that might come to mind when we think of trauma, what would happen to the shift? What if we start thinking of trauma in terms of the words like resiliency, powerful, strength, courageous, or where there's a renewed sense of purpose in life? What about advocacy, healing, thriving, hero? What if we see them as a fighter, warrior? And what about the role of gratitude and forgiveness in the concept of trauma and how we see it? So can you imagine if we approached sexual abuse survivors this way from the start, where they were heroes and fighters? It removes some of that blame and that shame and the isolation, but without minimizing or denying the horrific event that happened to them. So this shows that as a society, as a community, we can influence people's responses to trauma by the language and the words that we use, as well as from the framework and the perspective or the concepts that we use. We know that the words we and other people use shifts the story we carry around about our experiences. So the research that I had uses a social construction orientation or a social constructionist framework. And social constructionist theory locates the source of meaning and value and action in the relational connection among people, in their relationships together. It describes how people create meaning together and how this results in creating our future. So everything that's real for us comes out of community or relationship, they believe. We socially construct everything. So for example, gender identity, we are more than our biological parts. We socially construct what it means to be a boy, a girl, a man, a woman, or even an other, to not be defined by binary categories. So social construction is a way of talking, a way of looking, and it doesn't eliminate anything like science or religion, and instead believes there's multiple realities, multiple what is rights. Social constructionism also pays attention to the historical, cultural, and political discourses and the ways that knowledge is generated and sustained. A discourse provides a way of interpreting the world. It gives it meaning and makes it real. So when we look at trauma from a social constructionist lens, it can then contribute to opening up space for us to look at a different way of seeing this trauma and a different way of being together and a different way of seeing ourselves. It's a different lens of looking at something. So this work, this research focuses on complex and developmental childhood trauma, which is the response that children and adults can have when they have experienced adverse childhood events, usually within the caregiving system. Sometimes adults who have experienced trauma in their childhood tend to get stuck in what happened to them, and that they feel it holds them back or that it takes over their life. There was one person in the research said, it feels like it became the soul of his life. So in our lives, we have many stories about our experiences and who we are. These are stories that we tell ourselves, but it also includes those that we hear from others about ourselves or about how we should be. And these stories shift over time, depending on what other experiences we have had. So why would we want to change the story we have about our childhood trauma? We're only looking at shifting the story if it keeps us stuck. Many of the symptoms associated with trauma are in response to a horrific event, but they remain unresolved, buried, and they often create further symptoms and responses, sometimes that are very similar to mental health disorders, because of how we view the trauma in our society. We view it as something to be ashamed of, something to not talk about, something we blame ourselves for. This can create stories about ourselves and the trauma event that don't help us move forward in life and cause us great pain and limitations in how we want to live our life. So this work emphasizes the relational importance that we connect to our stories. It is about trauma stories and how we create space for alternative trauma stories through our relationships and through our dialogue. So just think for a moment now about the narratives you carry around about yourself. Reflect on how they were shaped by others. Reflect on how they were shaped by the environment, culture, history, politics, and dominant discourses. And what would have to happen to change this narrative, or what could happen that makes it change? Well, think about being at work, and maybe you see yourself at work as being productive, competent, confident, well-liked, included. And this is your experience for, let's say, 10 or 20 years. But then you get a new position, or a new supervisor, or you move to a new workplace, and this story can easily shift. Maybe people start seeing you instead as needy. They don't trust your judgment. Maybe they provide feedback to you on skills that they see as lacking. And they see your previously valued personality and work habits, your style and your skills, now as deficits. So how might this influence the story that you've carried around for the last 10 or 20 years about yourself as a professional? Or a story I hear a lot in the education world is about math, and adults telling me how they weren't good at math or they aren't good at math, and that's why their child may not be good at math. And as much as some of us have more talent than others in this area, how much of our math scores are attributed to this narrative, this story that we carry around about our math talents? So it's through these relationships, through these relational experiences, that the story can shift over time. I want to start showing you part of the framework here that comes with the story shifters. So we want to look at how can we tell our stories that both illustrate our strength and make us stronger. In trauma, with the dominant discourse, we have these victim voices over here on the right-hand side, and we have resistant voices that serve a purpose in our trauma story. And when I say voices, I mean the messages and the things that we are saying to ourselves in our head, the things that we are feeling and the things that we are thinking. And as we have discussed, the dominant discourses of trauma, the main way we talk and think about trauma, the conversation, mostly promote what I'm going to call the victim voices, where there are feelings of guilt and blame, disconnection, loneliness, and shame. Yet the resistant voices are also always present, and they make repeated efforts to fight these victim voices and these feelings. This can be demonstrated by behaviors, and they are sometimes interpreted as pathological or even seen as evidence of mental illness. An example from the interviews from this research involves to demonstrate this, involves a woman who repeatedly told her story as a youth about sexual abuse until someone listened and responded in a way that validated her experience in a meaningful way that fit with how she saw herself deep down inside as resilient and strong still. So, and she said she told her story repeatedly to strangers or anyone who would listen in an effort to receive some of this validation. She said she would speak about this trauma story repeatedly in the same way that she would talk about, let's say, going to the beach for the weekend. So this resistance, or the emotional resistance that we have, it can be emotional or it can be physical resistance as well. And this can be against the ways that where people are making us feel like victims, or that they are in part to blame for their own trauma experiences. With the physical resistance, it could be actually physically fighting back if something is happening. More likely, it's subtle resistance. An example of this might be a woman who is being physically abused by her partner, and when she's making his meal, she spits in it before she serves it to him. This is that subtle resistance. And the resistant voice only exists because of the dominant discourse. It's there to fight the victim voice. If the dominant discourse of trauma did not create victim voices, we wouldn't need these resistant voices. So this diagram shows that side of the framework. If you're fascinated by this concept of resistant voices like I was, you can explore it more from Alan Wade in some of his work from 1997. So what we want is we want to have skillful conversation that can explore some of the impacts of potential strengths, like how they survived their event, resourcefulness that they had. And this can lead to an enhanced understanding and compassion for oppressed people, and to have some passion for social justice, etc. So how we draw out these resistant voices and give them more space to challenge the dominant discourse of trauma, we can reconstruct our views on trauma away from this wounded mentality to shift to one that's more resilient and focused strengths. And this happens within the discursive context. So here you can see that we'll move to alternative stories, alternative meaning and identity, and I'll explore that a little bit more, where we get the resilient voices that give us an increased sense of belonging, connectedness, and personal agency. So how do we shift away from the dominant discourse and to create an alternative discourse? So what we have is the story shifters happening in the discursive context. And we want to make sure that when we talk about discursive context, we are looking at the environment and the language and the words that we use, but also the political, the social, the environmental, and the historical context as well. So an example of this would be if I was having a conversation, let's say in Toronto, Ontario, about women's rights, versus if I was having that same conversation in a Middle Eastern country where women are more oppressed, the conversation would look very different because of the discursive context, because of the influence of the historical, political, societal, and social factors within that. So basically the story shifters are happening in a discursive context around that. So it's just important to remember that. So the story shifters come in two dimensions, or there's two categories of story shifters. The one is relationships, or relational activity it could be called, and the other is culture or linguistics, such as language. And these 8 story shifters help shift the victim and resistant voices into ones of resilient voices, as you could see on the chart beforehand. And there's 4 story shifters in relationships and 4 in the culture and linguistics. So the story shifters in relationships are a stance of not knowing, the nature of the relationship and establishment of safety and trust, the meaning of the response while telling the story, and a shared experience. And I'll go through each one of these in a bit of detail. When we're looking at a stance of not knowing, what we mean by that is it's truly about listening to someone's story and being curious about and open to their perspective. It's about checking our assumptions and preconceived notions of what trauma looks like at the door. We call this a stance of not knowing in the therapy world too. So that we are not making assumptions about what the experience meant for this person. We're not judging them. We're setting aside our own beliefs and values and cultural influences as best we can. An example might be setting aside assumptions that we make about women who have experienced physical abuse. Maybe we see them as weak or having low self-esteem. Or how might we see people with addictions? What assumptions might we make about them, about how they manage their addiction? So a stance of not knowing is asking us to hold these assumptions and just listen to what the experience was like for them. And when we do this, it becomes a story shifter that results in the person sharing their story and feeling more comfortable since they don't feel blamed, they're feeling truly heard, and in turn they often end up sharing more of their story when there's some safety and trust there. So this story shifter opens the door to begin to examine alternative meanings to the trauma story. The second story shifter within the relationship category is the nature of the relationship and the establishment of safety and trust. So when we're sharing stories, people often reveal a little bit at a time and gauge what they're going to say next based on the person's response. This is how normal conversations happen, right? So they need to feel safety and trust and have a connection of some sort, even if it's a stranger, to keep sharing the story. The research data is telling us, though, that this level of detail and vulnerability that they show is somewhat different when it's shared with a stranger compared to when it's shared with a partner, a spouse, close friend, relative, etc. But regardless of your relationship, people need to feel safe and trust you with their story in order for them to be vulnerable and to share it. Makes sense, right? Within the story shifter relationship, the value of relationships when it comes to mentors and role models also proved very critical. When we look at the role of mentors here, it validated how the person saw themselves inside, how they wanted to be seen, and how they wanted others to see them away from the trauma event. And it validated their future plans for themselves. It offered a bright future. One participant in the research spoke about how their mentor saw a side of them that they wanted to grow. It was their professional self with skills and talents that fit within their field of work. And this other person was able to see that within themselves and to pull it out. Whereas role models within this story shifter relationship in the establishment of safety and trust, role models taught people how to cope, how to survive and thrive despite the trauma, how to move forward and be successful. Role models were identified as being really important here as a story shifter and sometimes being a turning point in the interviewees' lives. So we can just think of the role that teachers and coaches, supervisors, and relatives have here, right? We will speak about this a little bit more in the context of some of the other story shifters. The third story shifter within this relational activity category is the meaning of response while telling the story. How do you respond to a story when you're hearing it so it makes a difference? So participants spoke about feeling heard, validated, understood, and reassured that they were okay and that they weren't being defined by their experience. They felt compassion from the person who was listening to them. And as one person put it, he said he felt like a human being instead of feeling like an alien. Because in all the other conversations, he just felt like an alien and he felt like he didn't belong. The interviewees spoke about waiting for a better response from others. So when they told their story as youth and it was met with responses that made them feel like a victim or to blame, or that was no hope, there was no hope, or that made them feel wounded or damaged, instead they wanted that response to feel genuine. So they were waiting for that type of response. They were waiting to hear responses that made them feel resilient and strong. And I actually created some examples of some of these questions that might be a little intense for some initial or regular conversations, and maybe they're more reserved for a closer relationship, perhaps in a therapeutic setting. But these questions here are on the screen. So we could ask questions to help convey a meaning where we're not blaming or creating shame or further isolation. We could ask, who's on your side? What are your hopes for those who are close to you? What are your hopes for yourself? What experiences have been useful to you in your community or your communities where you lived? What community resources do you use? What are the good parts of your life? What else is there besides the trauma? What helps you do all these great things that you described to me? Have you experienced a turning point in your life that helped you see alternatives? What advice would you give others, or what do you think others could learn from your experiences? What are the questions should I ask you to better understand your experiences? Based on your values, your actions and your decisions, your choices and your risks, what are those that you want to take in the near future? Who in your life made a major contribution to your development and your growth? Are there other people you'd want to connect with? What would you say to them? What meaning would they have to you? And that what would they say to you? What would renewing this connection mean? Okay, so these are some things that could open up the door to have a different type of meaning conveyed when people might be sharing their trauma story. So for the story shifters in relationships, the next one then and the last one is a shared experience. When the listener briefly has shared that they have had a similar experience or know someone who did, it often provided hope to the other person and they felt like they could go on. They felt strong. They said they felt an instant connection to that person. They felt less isolated. Perhaps it even lent instant credibility to the listener and fast-tracked the establishment of the story shifter of safety and trust. Perhaps the person sharing their story assumed that person better understood their experience, rightly or wrongly. We've seen in the past few years the powerful experiences of the Me Too movement and the impact of sharing painful traumatic experiences. The powerful role of mentors and role models emerged here again in the story shifter, showing that those who have experienced trauma and how they can move forward to achieve their dreams and their goals and to further share their story. And this is really interesting for us therapists on how we share personal stories and struggles, because it's reviewed so much in our training and in professional development regarding how we maintain personal boundaries and an objective sense of self. So at this point, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that people need to be ready to share their story in a safe environment. And this framework does not by any means dismiss horrific experiences or feelings that emerge from experiencing trauma, regardless of these environmental responses from others and one's resilience and the relationship that we have with others. But what happens after the trauma event does not have to be as isolating, shaming, or blaming either. So with these story shifters, what happens is that the victim voices become quieter and the resilient voices have an opportunity to grow stronger. I also want to take a moment here before we move on to the other 4 story shifters in culture and linguistics to think about the last 4 story shifters and how they all are about relationships, and take a moment on what we know about people who have experienced trauma and their relationships. There's often a lot of impairment and unhealthy relationships there. So let's talk a moment about the social impact of trauma on childhood relationships, especially at school for kids. What we've heard is that at school, these kids often are last picked for teams. They have no or few friends. They're described as not doing their share of the work. They're described as hard to work with. They tend to provoke other kids and adults. They have very poor self-regulation skills with peers and others. They're often seen in schools and in the community as the troubled kids, or even in their family. And other people become anxious when they're near their child because they might think they're going to be potentially explosive, or their behaviors are seen as unpredictable or just different. and other parents or caregivers voice concerns for their child's safety because of this child, or they move away from the playground when the child comes there, or in the neighborhood. So we need to focus on helping these children, as well as helping adults and educators and community members in building and repairing relationships so that people see that these kids are more than their trauma. And we can do this by skill building and emotional intelligence skills for them, with them, and by providing resources and opportunities to boost resiliency. And this is where Michael Unger's research out of Dalhousie and Halifax really comes into play. So it's important for these children and these adults to be helped in building better peer relationships, repairing peer relationships, repairing adult relationships, repairing parent-child relationships, and having allies and building allies. And this work can be done by the trauma story and by shifting it because of what we know about these kids. And we can use these story shifters to help them change their identity and how they see themselves and how others see them. So when we look at story shifters in culture and linguistics or language, there's 4 of them: knowledge generation, media, social constructs, and language. And these 4 story shifters provide new information that creates a difference and models resilience in the trauma story. This again is a space where change can start to occur for people, and it can lead to more meaningful, perhaps deeper social interactions with each other. And I'll explain this a little further. So when we look at knowledge generation, it occurs within a relationship, and that information is then generated that creates a difference. Knowledge and information is generated, shared, and it was knowledge that was previously unknown to the person in the relationship that makes this difference. It can happen, and it does happen a lot, in the educational field or in the therapeutic setting, but it can also happen in social relationships and interactions where experiences are shared which give new information and new knowledge that ends up making a difference for that person. Our data in this research shows that this knowledge can include learning about signs, symptoms, and common responses of childhood trauma, even if it's coming from the current social construction and dominant discourse of it. This shows as well that the power and opportunity that education institutions have in shifting the story. So what I mean by that is an example from the interviews was when a person took a child development course in university and learned about how child abuse can impact development. It allowed him to better understand some of his responses that he was still having about his traumatic events, and that they were just that, responses, instead of as rebellious behavior, which is how he defined his behaviors previously, because he was numbing himself, avoiding life, as he put it, by using drugs and obsessively playing video games. So think about how a hockey coach or a teacher might interpret rebellious behaviors, maybe as defiance or being lazy or poor work ethics, when in fact the person is just merely trying to cope with the intrusiveness of the trauma and the shame, blame, and isolation that he feels. So this was considered a turning point in this person's life and the start for him of shifting his story, he said. And as in the other story shifters that we reviewed already, the resilient voices become stronger and the victim voices become weaker or silenced as people realize they're not alone in their suffering, and they learn about how others have coped and maintained hope. So the participant learned about the impact of trauma in his child development course, and he had read stories in his textbook as well about strategies that other people had used to cope with these trauma experiences. So moving on to the story shifter of media, how the media portrays trauma is also a factor in story shifting. When media portrays trauma with messages of hope for people, and it gives messages that trauma doesn't have to define you, then this can lead to a new construction or a new story of trauma for people. People who are successful can share their story of the struggle and the challenge that they had to get there so that others can see them as more than their success, that they can see the resilience and repeated attempts and setbacks in their struggle or success, or in playing the future, or in building the future that's so prominent now for them. Examples of this occurred when the NHL player Sheldon Kennedy revealed publicly that he was sexually abused by James, his junior coach and mentor. And Kennedy's revelations led to James being convicted in the 1990s, but also in 2012 for doing the same to other players, including retired NHL star Theo Fleury, who went on to become a strong advocate and a large voice for shifting stories and the impact of trauma. One of the participants who struggled with extreme drug addiction said he wants to see successful people and hear about how they overcame addictions in their past so that it would show him that recovery was possible. So let's just take a moment now to reflect upon the impact of trauma in our media. So think about a well-known person, a song, or a movie character. Think about resiliency factors and strategies that were shown in that movie or in the book, song, whatever, that impacts or that shows how people cope. And were these strategies adaptive or maladaptive? Because sometimes in a lot of movies we see the maladaptive ones. Were there messages that made it okay to reach out for help? But when I think of this, movies come to mind like A Beautiful Life, Reign Over Me with Adam Sandler, or The Tale, about a 13-year-old who was sexually abused by her coaches, or a more famous one would be the book and the movie The Room. Right? So what are the messages and strategies, and how might these be able to help someone who's experienced trauma shift their own story when they read or see the movie or listen to this song? So that's what the media story shifter is about. Social constructs as a dimension or a category that contributes to the story shifting, it contributes by generating different conversations about the trauma. So this is where shifts in language we use to talk about trauma and the images or constructs that are portrayed in the media can lead to shifts in reconstructing trauma and the alternatives that might be opened up to possibility. Again, this is the space that opens up where change can occur, and it can lead to more meaningful and perhaps deeper interactions with each other. It may also lead to shifts in how we label, diagnose, treat, and view trauma, or the reconstruction of it. An example of this emerged when one of the interviewees said that we need a new poster child for trauma, one that shows resilience and hope for the future, and not what we have now, which is more like a black and white photo of a little girl crying in the corner, or an adolescent with his hoodie up over his head. Someone else talked about having positive role models in the media to show that we went through trauma and can talk about it and move forward from it, show how to be resilient. And this is similar to what we had looked at in the media story shifter. So we don't just want to show the person's successes, but the struggle to get there. Michael Jordan documents that really well in his multiple attempts and in his route to success. With language, this is about the power of how language that we use influences the dominant discourse and social constructs of trauma, offering opportunities to shift this through conversation and be more aware and mindful of the words that we use. So we talked about language a little bit at the start of this webinar when I asked you to reflect on what words come to mind when we look at trauma or when we think about and define trauma. The language and the words are used in responses when one shares their story and can influence that. Right? The words that we use and that language conveys meaning and culture, right? And it roots us in our culture with the history, with politics, society. So an example of this is an interviewee, and he talked about the word rape in everyday language and how he hears a lot of it being used, such as, oh, I raped that bucket of chicken, was the example he used, which he said dumbs down its use. And then when you hear I was raped in a different context, it can take away from some of that meaning. So he recommends we need to reclaim this word instead of using the general word sexual assault. And this is similar to how the women's movement or other oppressed populations have reclaimed some of their words where strong stigma was attached. So I want to take a moment here to add that although I say anyone can be a facilitator to this story shifting process, I'm not dismissing the value of therapy or the therapeutic relationship, nor the skill required in trauma treatment, with a clinician. We know that these story shifters can occur within this therapeutic relationship, and that therapists have the expertise to help someone cope with the impact of the dominant discourse of trauma and these victim voices, these feelings of guilt, blame, loneliness, their suicidal tendencies, addictions, lack of hope, etc. And some of you also might be asking, what wasn't helpful? And what we found was pretty much aligned with the responses that are said to be within the dominant discourse of trauma. Responses that contribute to the person feeling like a victim, or comments that somehow convey it was their fault, like, oh, well, what were you doing dressed like that? Or, oh, well, she shouldn't have been out there at 3 a.m. anyways. What was she expecting? And these create distance between the person who is sharing their story and the person who's listening. And it's these things that make them feel like an alien. So when we look at this diagram, it shows us the process of how the dominant discourse of trauma can begin to be deconstructed. The victim and the resistant voices here on the right-hand side can be decreased or silenced. This opens up new space using these 8 story shifters across the circle, where we can potentially reconstruct the meaning that trauma holds, not only for the storyteller, but for our community and society. As resilient voices grow stronger and the identity is shifted away from one that's rooted in trauma, new meaning can be created along with hope, stronger connections, an increased sense of belonging, and a sense of personal agency that holds hope for the world. So story shifters and those who facilitate them may be in a role such as a mentor, practitioner, therapist, a sport coach, even a clerk at a grocery store or librarian. And they may hear part of a story, they may hear the entire story, but their responses add a nugget or a kernel, which allows the story to shift from one that offers possibilities outside of the victim voice. It may assist the resistant voices to become a little stronger or bolder in resisting the dominant discourse of trauma in order to open up feelings and strength in resiliency. It may also lead to further storytelling, connections, or even further social interactions that can help explore more of these non-victim aspects of trauma. As this happens, the voices within the victim voices, such as the loneliness, shame, guilt, powerlessness, lessen, while the feelings of resilience grow stronger and stronger. I wanted to just briefly explain the limitations of this story shifter framework. There are many, and I'll just talk about a few. The first one is that this is a case study and it's qualitative research. There are low numbers of participants. The demographics are very similar. Some of the participants even knew each other, and they may have even had a story shifter role with each other. And the participants were mostly youngish. They were under the age of 35, mostly. And I would be very curious if the participants had been in their 60s and 70s to hear what life experience at that point would have brought to the story shifter framework. And what about in different cultures? Would the story shifters be somewhat different, but still be categorized in the 2 main categories of relationships and culture and language? A few other limitations. We dealt with the type of trauma we dealt with was complex or developmental trauma. And a lot of the people that I had interviewed had experienced sexual abuse and other traumas. And did this influence the story shifter framework differently than if it was something else? What if we interviewed people who instead had victim and resistant voices that were really strong? Would these become even stronger after the interview? So we interviewed people who were not trapped in their trauma story. We also have here, I have here, sole researcher bias. I was the only researcher, and I wonder what would happen if others were involved. Would it be more objective? Would there be different biases regarding culture and age and things? I used a social construction orientation, as I had already explained, and maybe perhaps a blend of different scientific or social construction approaches would have yielded different results and had different meaning. There's also a lack of research of the story shifter framework to neurobiology, attachment, and therapeutic relationship, which we know has a very large role to play in trauma and in trauma healing. So, and the story shifter framework, as I said, is not meant to dismiss the value of therapeutic work, but it was beyond the scope of this dissertation to further explore that. Beyond interviewing people, we also had focus groups. And we know that there's comments in focus groups that influence each other's what they say, and also that the focus groups are only relevant to the community in which they occurred. So the focus groups I held were in my community in southwestern Ontario, and I also included an Indigenous population as their community. We also know that one of the big limitations of the story shifter framework is the potential for re-victimization. So how would we use this story shifter framework in a non-clinical way, let's say, or out of a therapeutic setting to ensure that the person sharing the story isn't re-victimized by someone who means well, but doesn't quite grasp the way the 8 story shifters should be used? So what safeguards would be put in place in order for us to make this a little more public with the story shifters? And how do we make sure that we're not potentially dismissing other voices? So I also want to talk about a resilience and growth rating scale that emerged from the community and practitioner forums that were part of this research, as well as from the interviews with participants. So one of the focus groups I did was with therapists, with practitioners, and we started talking about a tool. But the usefulness and meaning of this tool has not been tested, as this was beyond the scope of the dissertation. This tool provides statements that could generate dialogue to further provide information on where someone might be in the moment in time regarding their thoughts on dominant discourses of trauma. This scale could be used to potentially assist a practitioner to better understand the impact of an event on their client's thoughts or their life in general, in areas of thinking about the future or how much they rely on others or their community, and on how they're feeling resilient or not, and their readiness to move forward. This scale could be used as a resource or a guide for a practitioner to use with a client to open up the possibilities of a dialogue about strength and about these resilient voices, as well as to potentially gain insight into how embedded a client might be in the dominant discourses of trauma. This scale could assist those using it in exploring the role of existing story shifters that are already there, plus creating opportunities to open space to increase the presence of other story shifters in their life. It provides an opportunity to begin exploring alternatives to these dominant discourses and open possibilities for the future, especially regarding hope and resiliency. This tool has been designed for use with therapeutic practitioners and clinicians, but it's not in use yet. So we know from post-traumatic growth theory that growth and distress coexist. And the tool that I'll show you in a moment identifies these two concepts, growth and distress, with a variety of statements within each of these concepts. So to use this scale, a client rates a statement on a scale of 1 to 10 regarding where they are along this continuum of opposing statements, with 1 being full agreement with the first part and 10 being full agreement with the last section. So this scale isn't meant to officially or formally provide a measurement. It doesn't provide a score, but it merely is just a tool to open up the conversation about the impact of dominant discourses and the victim voices, and explore strength and presence of resilient voices. And with this, scores that would fall in the mid-range potentially demonstrate how growth and distress from trauma may coexist. Okay, so here's the scale. We'll just go through it here line by line. So the first statement is, people usually hurt or disappoint me, versus I look for the best in others as much as I can. So again, to use this, the client might rate themselves between 1 and 5 if they're more along the people usually hurt or disappoint me. But if they are feeling like they look for the best in others as much as they can, they would probably rate themselves between 5 and 10 or 6 and 10. The next statement is, my future doesn't look promising. My future is bright. My life is pretty meaningless. I can find meaning in my life. I think of death more often than before the trauma event. I look forward to the future. I rarely feel happy. I recognize and cherish moments of happiness. I feel like I can hardly trust anybody. I have faith in some people now. I have little faith or sense of spirituality. My spirituality or faith feels stronger. I now can't accomplish my life goals because of what happened to me. I feel like I can succeed now. My relationships don't bring me much value. I value my relationships more than ever. I feel destroyed inside. I feel strong, resilient, and more alive than ever. I don't bother taking care of myself. I am much better at self-care. I can make a difference. I'm an advocate for the issues I care most about. I have no control over most things in my life. I find new opportunities when I look for them. I have no one to support me. I have a few people in my life I can count on. I feel defeated. I feel like a warrior. I feel like I don't belong to my community. I have a sense of belonging in my community. I feel like I can't reach out. I can connect and relate to others around me in my community. My community can't help those who really need it. I can count on my community to help me and others if I need it. I have to fight for almost everything. Good things come my way sometimes. I'm a victim of trauma versus I can change my trauma story. Trauma doesn't have to define who I am. And we know that people can once you're over on the side, if you're 6 to 10 on some of these statements, it doesn't mean you stay there. We know that with trauma healing, there's a lot of bouncing back and forth, and a lot of different things can change throughout the day, throughout the weeks and the months and the year. But again, this just gives us a starting point for a conversation. So this scale might hold some promise in the therapeutic and clinical setting as a tool to guide the work and to hear all the voices of trauma. But again, this hasn't been tested in this dissertation. And how the resilient and growth rating scale applies in the clinical setting is yet to be determined, and further investigation of this was briefly elaborated upon in the limitations section. But I'm asking you to please not to use or duplicate this tool without permission. And perhaps there is some future research we can do to evaluate the usefulness and the meaning of this tool in the clinical setting. So I wanted to share with you some final thoughts from Mark Epstein, who wrote a book in 2013 called The Trauma of Everyday Life. And he says, shutting down one kind of feeling inevitably shuts down all of them. In protecting ourselves from the unbearable effect of trauma, we also close ourselves off from love, joy, empathy. Our humanity resides in our feelings, and we reclaim our humanity when we direct our curiosity at that which we would prefer to avoid. So this quote for me really speaks to that tension between the victim-resistant voices and the resilient voices. So in summary, we can choose how we see what happens to us by the meaning that we give it, even if we can't control what happened to us. And the stories that we carry around can shift depending on our interactions and our relationships with others and how they see our stories and ourselves. And healing from trauma is contextual and is about relationships, resources, and opportunities. And in fact, what we've learned from this data is that anybody can be a story shifter. So now we'll move back to Linda, and we will open this up for questions. And I'm going to open my laptop here and see what happens. See if you can see me.
Oh,
can you see me? Thank you for being patient and seeing me as a no-name for a little bit there.
It's very nice to see your face as well as having heard you present. I'm going to jump right in at this point, Barbara, and Diane's going to join me. We're going to go back and forth a little bit because there's a number of comments and questions that have come in.
Okay.
We want to share those with you and get your response. And we're going to keep all the ones that related to the tool you just discussed just a little bit later and start with some other questions. So the first one is just a basic question. Could you just flesh out a little bit, Barbara, what you mean by dominant. When you refer to dominant discourse and throughout your presentation, could you just talk a little bit more about what you mean by dominant?
Okay, so a dominant discourse is what the common or the prominent concept, words, and language are that we're using to describe or convey something. Right. So the dominant discourse of trauma is about the language and the words that we use to describe trauma. And again, when we think about trauma, usually what comes to mind are these these negative, I'm going to use the word negative, these deficit words like the loneliness, the shame, the blame, the nightmares, the terror, right, suicidal ideation, these negative words, when instead I'm challenging that. As much as a horrific event happened, and I'm not minimizing or denying that, we can also use other words to help people feel strong. So if the dominant discourse is shifted to things like warrior and hero and strength for what happened to them, then they can see themselves differently. And the story they tell themselves about what happened to them is, I'm a warrior, I'm a fighter, that this happened to me. It doesn't necessarily take away from nightmares and some of the other things that happen necessarily, but it can help us cope with some of that and shift better into feelings of resiliency and strength and having hope for our future and connections. Is that a little clearer?
Yes, I hope so, for the people that were wondering about that. So thank you for that. Well, one of the comments that we received, Barbara, was that some people are working with individuals who are acknowledging birth trauma, traumatic experiences around birth. And I just wondered, so much of the shifting the story, shifting the discourse is around language, and yet that would be a pre-verbal individual that was experiencing a traumatic event, whether that be a very challenging birthing, or whether that be something else. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that in any way that you see fit.
Right. So these story shifters are about the story that we carry around about our trauma and about ourselves. So if you don't have a birthing, like if you don't have that feeling of if you don't know your birthing story, right, then you might have some. It doesn't mean we don't have responses of trauma, right? So we know that if a 1-year-old has a horrific traumatic event, that even if they don't have that story or they can't tell it, we know that the body still remembers that, and there's lots of other ways to deal with that. The experiences, the physical experiences, and the emotional experience, and even the neurological experiences. But that's not their story. We're not shifting their story at that point. We're helping to heal the brain and to give them some skills to cope with what's happened to them. So with the birth story, if they have a story that someone told them about their birth, is that what we're dealing with? Because that's different, right? So then...
I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I think it's let's go with, and let's say it's people that come in and they may not have awareness in memory themselves, but they are aware they experienced it and wonder if what they're experiencing is related. Let's just use that as an example.
Right. So if that's their story, then we can still look at what meaning do they give to that story. So let's say within the birth story, their mother abandoned them and their mother left, if that's their birth story, right? What meaning, what does that mean for them? But then also talking about what are the other things in your life that are more than that story for you? Right. And so it's shifting some of that out, because if they're carrying around the story that they were abandoned and they were rejected, that's going to be influencing how they interact with the rest of society. Right. So helping them to get in touch with the other aspects of themselves and other aspects of the story as well, because somehow, as much as, let's say, they were abandoned, they're still alive. So there's something good that happened there. And again, we don't ever want to dismiss what happened to them. We don't want to dismiss the trauma, but we also want to make sure that people are looking at some of the resiliency voices that happened as well.
I think just before I turn it over to Diane for sharing a question, I think there were some comments about that or queries that it is that balance. It's how do we do, it's exactly what you said, and maybe people looking for some input from you, Barbara. It's about that balance. How do we do this shifting while doing exactly what you say, making sure we're not minimizing and making sure we realize the impactful experiences they may be having?
Yes, absolutely. So, and even the story shifters are also starting about validating, right? One of the first ones was about, making sure that we're listening and not making assumptions. So even just doing that first one, where we're not trying to shift the story, but we're just listening from a non-judgmental and non-assuming stance, can help, because a lot of people, when they start to share their story, they don't even get that. They don't even get that. Instead, they get a lot of negative comments about why or how that happened to them. And again, when we are in this work as part of our field in the social science field, we want to make sure that we don't, in our first session with a client who's been sexually abused, let's say, as a child, and they're now a 50-year-old woman, we don't go right in there and start, all these story shifters right away. We first want to just listen and hear their story. But what the point of this research is, we don't just want to end there, right? We don't just want to talk about the horrific parts of the story, but also get them in touch with, how did you survive that? Like let's talk about this role of resistant voices, and how does that impact your life? And how do the victim voices impact your life and your relationships now? Right? And what about these resilient voices? What do you hear in them? How do those impact your life, right? So it truly is that balance. And I tried to emphasize that many times today, because I really don't want people to walk away thinking, oh yeah, we just go and do these story shifters and dismiss the story.
Yeah. And I don't think that was the case. I think that the fact that the person used the word balance, and the fact that some of the comments, it was, we hear you, how do we make sure, because that is so important.
Yes.
So it was more about that.
Yes. Yeah, and we also know, if I can just go on a little bit, we also know with trauma-specific treatment, the evidence behind trauma-specific treatment is to really let people tell their story from their view and just keep drawing it out and hearing more and more of the story and the details and sitting with that. Right? And really absorbing how that has impacted their life, and looking at that and starting there. So we know, the evidence shows us that listening to the story first is a very, very important way that we would balance some of this.
Yes. Diane, would you share one of the questions that you're taking down?
Yeah. So one of the questions was, how do we ensure there is space for those who've been silenced through cultural power when systems in place reinforce this? It seems that change needs to happen at the individual level, but also at the system level. How can this come about?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have learned so much more about this since I've done this research. And I think if I was redoing this research, I would definitely add a voice of some of that systemic bias and the inequity and the role that we know that it plays in trauma and in healing. But that said, what we know about dominant discourses and social construction is that we can shift some of this through an individual basis, but also through a collective basis, right? So if we can start to look at trauma differently through the words and the media, the language, and how we do this differently, we can also look at systemic biases and inequities in the same way. It's about how we start to shift some of these languages and the words and the concepts that we attach to trauma and inequities, to make sure that people are understanding that there is there's privilege there. The rest of us are privileging or benefiting from other people's systemic inequities, which cause trauma.
Yes. it just right along that vein, one of the comments that came in, and there might have been more than one actually, was we need to decolonize trauma work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I disclosed at the start of this research the perspective that I took this on, right? So I am, I said middle class, middle age, although middle age is probably a bit of a stretch right now. But English speaking, immersed in Canadian culture is what I had tried to say. So, and I did consult with an Indigenous population around this story shifter framework, and they said, this really aligns with our medicine wheel, and this really fits with how we see some of the healing in our society. So I was actually, to be honest, I was surprised at that they saw it aligned as that, and they didn't see it as more colonial, just given my background and my perspective. So, yeah, but absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Made a number of references throughout your presentation, Barbara. And I'm sorry if I'm not paraphrasing, well, but basically I'm more than the traumatic event that I experienced. I'm more than, quotes, the victim that people may see me as.
Mm-hmm.
And you made references, gave some examples, which we really appreciated in terms of obviously children, but obviously adults as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just going to share and then ask you to comment. So often, just recently, a woman who had experienced a lot of traumatic violence from an intimate partner shared that she was no longer accepting invitations to talk about what happened to her. And so often, as part of fundraising or part of other educational events, we invite people with lived experience of various traumatic events to share with us. And while we know the importance of the voices of lived experience, it really made us step back and think about, and she said, would you like me to come and talk to you about a healing journey and some of the really empowering work that I'm doing with other women? And I just wanted to share that and one, just hear your response and within the framework that you've shared with us today, but also if you could think of that in terms of children and the children you've worked with as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. I'm so glad that she says that, because the more we tell our story from a dominant discourse of trauma, the more we start talking about the blame and the shame and the isolation and the impact that we feel. And if we just leave it there, that feels terrible for us, right? And that's not what we want to convey. That's not who we are. That's an event that happened to us and it was horrific, but we're more than that event. And instead we should be talking about the resiliency and the strength and the strategies that we use to cope, because that's what the people were saying. I want to know about what strategies you use, because I'm in the same situation. Share these strategies. Give me hope that someday I could get on stage and share my story that way. Give me hope that someday I could be, finish my university courses or be a teacher or something like that. What I've also heard when I did these interviews is that so much of the help in our society is tied to people presenting their victim voices. So much funding, you don't get funding for a lot of things, you don't get a lot of help unless you meet this certain criteria, and you have to come from you have to talk about how terrible this thing is that happened to you, and how you're not coping with it. I shouldn't say no one, often people aren't also talking about the strengths and what's going well and how we can boost that and keep that going further. And with the kids, we often get at the school board a lot of people asking to come in as adults and they say, you know, I had, as a youth, I got involved with the wrong crowd and I had addictions, or I really struggled with depression, and I, you know, made several suicide attempts and things like that. But I want to show kids, you know, that I survived that, and that I'm, you know, that I'm still here, and maybe I can help them not get involved in some of that. And what we say is, you know, we want to hear about the strategies that we use. We want to hear about the hope that you had throughout, even when you were suicidal. What hope did you have? What did you hang on to, or who helped you? What are the strategies? What, you know, what was your mind saying to yourself to help you cope with some of that? Yeah.
I just, because you just mentioned sharing those strategies, and we're hosting, and we want to share this with the whole audience and yourself, Barbara. We're hosting a trauma and violence intervention research conference, and we're ending the whole conference. It's June 9th and 10th. Well, 9th is the pre-conference, and 10th and 11th is the conference. But the final speaker is Jean-Paul Bedard, and he has just interviewed some 50 odd people who have experienced traumatic events and have succeeded in so many different ways, and actually in many cases are well known to the general population, while the fact that they had experienced a traumatic event may not be. But the whole purpose of his interviewing these individuals was to do exactly what you said, Barbara, to hear their stories of resilience, their pathways, as we would call it, to find or strengthen resilience. And then he has taken that and said, are there commonalities amongst their stories? And what can we learn from that? And as someone with lived experience of trauma himself, it's just interesting that it's exactly what became so important to Jean-Paul Bedard was exactly what you say can be so helpful, and coming to share that at the conference. So I just wanted to share that with you.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And you know, Linda, that's where the dissertation came from. That was my research question, is how do we shift this concept of trauma, and how do we share some of these strategies? And I ended up, you know, interviewing people who then were telling me, here's my story. So I interviewed them 3 times. The first time was, here's my story. And then the next time we kind of really drilled down on that story and teased out all the factors. We looked at victim voices, and then we looked at resistant voices, and then we looked at resilient voices, and they were all there in their story. And then we really played on the resilient voices, and looked at the pathways, right? What helped them meet those resilient voices, what you know, community factors, what relational factors were in place for those resilient voices to really strongly emerge. And that's where the story shifters came from. And that's also why this discursive concept, this discursive context concept came from. That's really hard to say, sorry. Right, and that's why I had to kind of explain it, even though it's a little bit wordy, but it's really important is that these things take place in that environment, that influences how people are receiving and telling their story.
Just thinking about the time, do you want to ask about the tool?
Yes. Thank you, Di. I've gotten so involved in this conversation that I'm losing track of time. So we're going to switch to the tool because we have just a short time left. And one fairly quick question, I think, and then a couple of others to build on it. But the quick one is, you mentioned that with permission, or don't use the tool without permission, the resilience and growth rating scale. And there were people just saying, but if they got that permission, could they use it? And I think they're just seeking that extra clarification. If you would respond to that, Barbara.
So you're seeing me with mixed feelings. Yeah, so the tool hasn't been used in a clinical setting. It emerged from the data. So I don't know how helpful it would be. And I would love if people are going to use the tool, then maybe we could engage in a small research project to do that. But then in order to use the tool and do that, we have to have an ethics review, right? Which takes a little bit of time. So maybe what I'll do at this point is if people want to use the tool to email me. I don't know if I'll be bombarded by emails at that point, but let's just take it from there, and I'll collect some names, and maybe someone would want to partner with me on some of this research, or maybe an institution wants to help me with take on some of the ethics review for some of that. But,
right.
Okay. Sorry.
No,
it might be a quick question, but it's very complicated for me.
That's good. So what you're asking is that anybody who's interested in potential use of the tool to contact you, Barbara. Yeah. And the last slide had your email contact, I believe, on it.
Yeah.
So that's wonderful. And the slides, because you were so kind to give us your permission, will be posted with the recording on our website. So that's everybody can find that. So that's very, very good. Diane, did you have a question related to the tool, or did I take them all?
I think you took them all, but maybe I'll ask this one.
Okay,
yes. There's one question that said, why lead with distress statements instead of leading with resilient statements?
In the tool.
In the tool.
That's a good question. Usually, I guess because I was using a Likert scale of 1 to 10, and usually 1 to 5 is more, associated with lower, less type of thing. You could easily flip it. That's a really good question. I'd be open to that. Yeah. No. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I understand the question is, let's start with a positive, right? Let's start with some of that. But you do ask the question at the same time, like just as I read it, you do ask them. So you don't say, just that one part. You say the same and say, where are you on that continuum? But yeah, it'd be neat to flip it. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just looking at our time, and Barbara, I know we could go on and have a wonderful discussion for quite a while longer. But we get a lot of feedback. People appreciate that we honor the hour and 15-minute time commitment because people have other commitments. So with that, on behalf of our team, I want to thank you so much for sharing with us today, for the work you have done and continue to do, and your openness to people contacting you and for us to continue to benefit from your learning. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And I must say, you are calm under stress. The technical problems, any of us who experience that just before we go live, that is an unnerving experience for many of us. And I just think that you showed great resilience under that situation. So thank you again, and we'll look forward to future contact.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.